Nobody in that briefing room believed him. Not the American intelligence officer who had been tracking insurgent movement across Helmand Province for 3 months using overhead surveillance, signals intercepts, and a database of over 40,000 assessed threat indicators. Not the British liaison colonel who had seen enough combat in 2 wars to know when a man was reading the ground correctly and when he was letting nerves write ghost stories into empty countryside. Not the convoy commander, a U.S. Army captain with 2 previous Afghan tours who had just reviewed a fresh intelligence summary that assessed Route 611 as amber, elevated caution, not red, not black, not the road you cancel the mission to avoid. The summary was 4 pages long. It had been compiled by analysts working from a facility with air conditioning, encrypted feeds from 3 separate drone platforms, and access to signal intelligence that could identify a mobile phone conversation from 200 kilometers away. The Gurkha sergeant's assessment was not 4 pages long. He pointed at a bend in the road on a laminated map and said 7 words. "This convoy will not survive the night." Then he explained why, in terms so specific, so rooted in the textures of the ground and the behavior of the people who lived on it, that the American intelligence officer stopped taking notes and started listening differently. Not to the words, to the architecture behind the words, to the realization that this man was reading the landscape the way a doctor reads a patient's face, not cataloging symptoms, but understanding the body behind them, understanding that the silence on that road and the angle of the shadows and the pattern of foot traffic recorded that afternoon, and the specific quality of the dust disturbed at the roadside added up to something that no satellite pass and no radio intercept and no threat assessment compiled from a screen in a fortified compound could have assembled. He was reading the ground with eyes trained in the hills of Nepal and honed across years of operations in the worst terrain the British Army had seen since Korea. And what he was reading told him that men were waiting in the dark beyond that bend with the patient certainty of people who had been told this convoy was coming. The convoy commander ordered a route change. The next morning, the original route was cleared by a combat engineering team. They found 3 buried improvised explosive devices in the road surface at the bend the Gurkha sergeant had pointed at on the map. Alongside the road, in positions that had been occupied within the previous 12 hours, they found the remnants of an ambush formation, discarded water bottles, shell casings from rehearsal fires into a berm, a command wire spool with approximately 60 meters of cable still attached. The ambush had been prepared for at least 40 people. The convoy had been carrying 11. The intelligence summary for that sector had not changed. Still amber. Still elevated caution, still not red. To understand how a Gurkha sergeant read something that a multi-million-dollar intelligence infrastructure had missed, you have to understand where that sergeant came from. You have to understand the mountains that made him, the selection that shaped him, the institutional history that ran through his veins like a second bloodstream, and the specific quality of attention that 200 years of British Gurkha service had refined into something that looks, from the outside, almost like a form of combat clairvoyance. It is not clairvoyance, it is something more unsettling than that. It is the product of training and culture and accumulated operational knowledge so dense and so specific that it simply outperforms technology in the narrow but critical space where human pattern recognition beats data processing. In the mountains, on the road, in the silence before the firing starts. This is that story. The province of Helmand in southern Afghanistan is approximately the size of Switzerland. It runs from the Hindu Kush foothills in the north down to the baked clay flatlands of the Dashti Margo, the desert of death, in the south. Its central artery is the Helmand River, which winds through a green zone of irrigated farmland, so narrow in places that you can stand at its edge and watch the desert begin within 100 meters. In 2006, when British forces formally assumed responsibility for security in Helmand Province from American units that had held it since the initial invasion 5 years earlier, The province was being described by NATO planners as the center of the Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan. That description was accurate in the way that calling the Pacific Ocean the center of world's water supply is accurate. It captures the scale while failing entirely to convey what it means to be inside it. The 2nd Battalion, Royal Gurkha Rifles, had already been in Afghanistan in 2001, returning for further operational tours in 2003, 2004, and again in 2005. The 1st Battalion would deploy to Helmand in 2006-07 as part of 16 Air Assault Brigade, and the soldiers who arrived in the province that year stepped into a war that was nothing like the optimistic reconstruction mission that British commanders had been briefed on in London. The Taliban had not been defeated in 2001. They had retreated, reorganized, and returned in strength. And Helmand, with its vast opium economy providing funding, its river valleys providing cover, and its tribal geography providing a recruitment pool that stretched across the border into Pakistan, was where they had returned in greatest numbers. The British soldiers who deployed to Helmand that year faced a Taliban insurgency that had incorporated, at enormous cost in blood and intelligence, the lessons of the previous 5 years of coalition operations. They understood that large armored convoys on predictable routes were targets. They understood that helicopter movements generated drone shadows that announced their approach 20 minutes before they arrived. They understood that cellular communications were compromised. They had adapted. They moved in small groups on foot through terrain that no conventional military would willingly enter. They used human couriers instead of radios. They cached weapons in compounds that intelligence services had no record of. They buried improvised explosive devices on roads that had been assessed as clear 24 hours earlier because the assessment had been made by a machine orbiting at altitude, and a machine could not see the man who walked along the verge after midnight and pressed a pressure plate into the soil under 6 inches of packed earth. Against this enemy, operating in this environment, the Gurkhas brought something that neither the best American technology nor the British Army's own excellent conventional infantry could replicate in quite the same way. They brought the specific competence that emerges when you take young men from the mountains of Nepal, subject them to the most ruthlessly competitive military selection process on earth, train them for years in the jungles of Brunei and the hills of Wales and the close-quarter battle ranges of the United Kingdom, and then deploy them into terrain that their bodies, shaped by generations of living at altitude on vertical ground, understand at the level of muscle memory. The mountains of Helmand are not the mountains of Nepal, but mountains are mountains. The way a path crosses a ridge and the angle at which it descends into a valley and the specific silence of terrain where normal human movement has recently stopped are things that men from the hills of Nepal recognize the way a fisherman recognizes the surface of water before a storm. The sergeant in question had been in the British Army for 11 years when his battalion deployed to Helmand in 2006. He had grown up in a village in the hills of central Nepal, the son of a man who had himself served in the Brigade of Gurkhas for 22 years before retiring. He had attempted British Army selection at the age of 17 and passed on the first attempt, which was not unusual for recruits from the hill regions of Nepal, where the physical requirements imposed by the terrain of daily life produce a baseline of fitness and endurance that is genuinely difficult to replicate through conventional military training. He had served in Kosovo, East Timor, and Sierra Leone. He had done one operational tour of Afghanistan before this one. He was 30 years old, 5 feet 8 inches tall, and built with the particular dense solidity that characterized Gurkha soldiers from the hill tribes of Nepal, the Gurungs and Magars and Rais and Limbus, men whose legs had been shaped by decades of climbing on ground that would destroy the knees of most Western soldiers within a week. He was, by every formal metric available to the British Army's assessment system, an exceptional non-commissioned officer. His command of English was precise. His tactical understanding had been described by his commanding officer as instinctive in a way that does not do justice to the amount of work that went into developing that instinct. He read ground the way other men read text. To understand what reading ground means in the context of a Helmand insurgency in 2006, you have to understand what ground sign awareness actually is and why it matters. It is not a mystical capacity, it is a learned skill set, so deeply internalized through training and operational experience that it operates below the threshold of conscious analytical thought. It is the ability to process environmental information simultaneously across multiple sensory channels, visual, auditory, olfactory, and tactile, and to recognize patterns of disturbance that indicate human activity without those indicators being individually obvious enough to register on a systematic intelligence assessment. The specific indicators of an imminent ambush or improvised explosive device emplacement are documented extensively in British Army field doctrine and in coalition counter-IED guidance developed painfully over years of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The disturbed soil of a recently dug device, a length of command wire half buried along a drainage ditch, the absence of civilian foot traffic on a route that routinely carried it, dogs that are not barking where dogs habitually barked, a compound gate closed at a time when compound gates were normally open, the position of a child on a rooftop at an angle that suggested not idle curiosity but deliberate observation, a shepherd moving his flock away from a specific stretch of road rather than toward the grazing at the edge of it. Each of these indicators in isolation is ambiguous. A dog doesn't bark for 100 reasons. A gate closes for 100 reasons. The shepherd moves his flock because he chooses to. But the accumulation of these indicators, processed simultaneously and weighed against a deep background knowledge of normal human behavior in a specific environment at a specific time of day, produces a signal that experienced soldiers describe with a consistency that is itself remarkable. The Americans called it a sixth sense. The U.S. Office of Naval Research launched a formal study in 2012 to understand the mechanism behind the battlefield intuition that had repeatedly saved lives in Iraq and Afghanistan, identifying it as a form of implicit pattern recognition, the ability to detect and act on environmental patterns without consciously and intentionally analyzing them. The study was valuable. The researchers correctly identified that the capacity was trainable and that it derived from accumulated experiential learning rather than any innate mystical ability. What the study could not fully capture was the specific intensity of the training environment that produced this capacity at its highest level in Gurkha soldiers, because that environment had been operating and refining itself for over 200 years, and the shaping of it began not in a military training facility, but in the mountains of Nepal. The Brigade of Gurkhas recruits approximately 200 young Nepalese men per year from a pool that in recent years has comprised between 15,000 and 28,000 applicants. The competition for those 200 places is so intense that it has shaped the culture of entire hill districts in Nepal, where multi-generational families of Gurkha soldiers produce sons who begin physical preparation for selection years before they reach the minimum recruitment age of 17. The selection process in Nepal begins at the district level, where Gala Walas, retired Gurkha soldiers who conduct initial screening in remote hill villages, assess physical fitness, educational aptitude, and what can only be described as the quality of the candidate, not a formal assessment category. A judgment made by men who have served in the British Army for decades and who know from long experience what the regiment requires. The physical tests conducted in Nepal are extraordinary. The signature event is the Doko race, a 5.5-kilometer uphill run carrying a traditional Nepali wicker basket, the Doko loaded with 25 kilograms of sand, to be completed in under 43 minutes. The race climbs over 300 meters of elevation on terrain that British Army physical training instructors have described as deliberately punishing. It tests not running speed, but loaded uphill endurance, the capacity that matters in mountain warfare, the ability to carry weight at altitude, on gradient, without catastrophic physical collapse. The candidates who pass it arrive in the United Kingdom already possessing a baseline of mountain fitness that takes years for conventional British recruits to develop. The Gurkha Training Company at Catterick Garrison has recorded a 100% pass rate for completing the combat infantry course in multiple recent intakes, a figure that is approximately twice the British Army average for the same course. By the time a Gurkha rifleman completes initial training and joins his battalion, he has been selected from roughly 100 applicants for every place available, completed a physically demanding training pipeline, and arrived in his unit with a cultural inheritance that treats military service not as a career option, but as an existential calling. The motto of the Brigade of Gurkhas is taken from a Nepali proverb that translates as, "Better to die than to be a coward." This is not rhetorical decoration. It is a live operational philosophy that has been validated across every conflict the brigade has fought since 1815, and it produces in Gurkha soldiers a threshold of acceptable risk that is genuinely different from the calculation made by men who did not grow up in a culture where military service was the defining mark of a man's worth and the source of his family's honor. But the quality that made the Gurkha sergeant read that road correctly was not courage. Courage is common. What was uncommon was the depth and specificity of his pattern recognition, built across 11 years of service and multiple operational deployments, on top of a childhood spent in terrain that trained him to read mountain ground the way a language trained a man to read text. He grew up on paths that required constant attention to the surface underfoot because a missed step in the wrong place meant a fall of 50 or 100 meters. He grew up in a community where the signs of human movement in remote terrain mattered because they told you whether the path ahead had been used, who had used it, and when. These are not skills that a formal military training program develops from scratch. They are skills that military training accelerates and refines in men who already possess the foundational capacity. On the night the Gurkha sergeant made his assessment, the convoy was preparing to conduct a routine supply run along a stretch of road in Helmand Province that had been used regularly for the previous 6 weeks without incident. The intelligence picture was cautious but not alarming. The drone coverage for the area had been intermittent for the previous 18 hours, a consequence of competing priorities across the theater and the limited number of platforms available to cover a province the size of Switzerland. The signal's intelligence picture was quiet. The human intelligence available from local sources had produced nothing specific about that route on that night. The sergeant had been tasked with route reconnaissance the previous afternoon, a standard procedure before major convoy movements, and he had walked a section of the planned route with 2 other Gurkha riflemen. The walk took approximately 4 hours. During that time, he recorded 12 specific observations that he considered individually unremarkable and collectively alarming. A section of road surface approximately 400 meters from the bend, where the devices were later found, showed fresh soil disturbance at the right-hand verge, consistent with recent digging rather than natural erosion or animal activity. The soil color was different from the surrounding surface, darker by a shade that would have been invisible from altitude. A drainage ditch running parallel to the road for approximately 80 meters had been recently cleared of the vegetation that normally grew in it. Clearing a drainage ditch is normal agricultural activity. Clearing a drainage ditch that runs parallel to a road used by coalition convoys in a section where the ditch provides a concealed approach to the road surface from a covered position 200 meters away is something else. The foot traffic that normally used the stretch of road in the late afternoon, local families returning from market, shepherds moving animals, women carrying water from the irrigation canal, had been reduced to near zero by midday. This was not characteristic of the normal pattern the sergeant had observed on previous days in that area. The chai shop at the small junction 300 meters short of the bend had closed early. The owner, a man in his 40s who had been consistently present on every previous reconnaissance, was not there. His absence from his own business on a busy road in the middle of the afternoon was, in isolation, meaningless. In context, it was one more piece of the picture. The sergeant did not call what he observed a pattern. He did not use that word in his report or in his verbal assessment to the briefing room. He said the road does not feel right. And then he described, in specific operational detail, the 12 things he had observed and what the combination of those 12 things told him about likely enemy activity in the previous 24 hours. The American intelligence officer wrote some of it down. Then he stopped writing and listened differently. And then he pulled out his own briefing notes and read them again against what the sergeant had just said. And the intelligence summary, compiled from orbital platforms and encrypted signals and database analysis and everything that a multi-billion-dollar surveillance architecture could produce, said Amber. Elevated caution, consistent with previous threat levels on this route. The sergeant said this convoy will not survive the night. The convoy commander ordered the route change. It was not an easy decision. Route changes have costs, logistical, temporal, and in terms of the credibility of the intelligence assessment cycle that the entire campaign depended on. Ordering a route change on the basis of a sergeant's gut feeling about a drainage ditch meant, in institutional terms, a degree of deference to human judgment over technical intelligence that required a specific kind of commander to authorize. A commander who understood that human pattern recognition, developed to a sufficient degree of resolution, could outperform technical surveillance in precisely the conditions that existed in Helmand Province in 2006. A commander who had perhaps worked alongside enough Gurkha soldiers in enough difficult places to understand that the phrase "does not feel right," coming from this particular source, carried a weight of operational significance that no numerical threat assessment could replicate. The 1st Battalion Royal Gurkha Rifles deployed to Helmand in 2006 with D Company, 2nd Battalion having already been there since January of that year, initially as force protection for Camp Bastion before transitioning to offensive operations in the Sangin Valley and now Zad. What both battalions found in Helmand was a version of counterinsurgency warfare that challenged every assumption about what British military capability looked like in the 21st century. The Taliban in Helmand were not the disorganized, irregular fighters of early media coverage. They were a disciplined, tactically adaptive opponent who had learned from every previous engagement with coalition forces, who understood the signature patterns of Western military movement, and who had developed an IED campaign that was specifically designed to defeat the route clearance procedures that coalition forces had developed in Iraq and were now applying in Afghanistan. The Gurkhas brought to this environment a specific set of capabilities that complemented, and in some respects surpassed, the broader British Army infantry toolkit. Their physical endurance at altitude was unmatched in the coalition. The mountains of Helmand Province, which reach 3,000 meters in the northern districts, are comparable in gradient and altitude to the hills of central Nepal, where Gurkha soldiers grew up. Where British infantry companies operating in the same terrain reported significant attrition from altitude sickness and physical exhaustion after extended operations above 2,500 meters, Gurkha companies moved at their normal operational pace. This was not a minor advantage. In mountain counterinsurgency, the ability to move faster and further than the enemy in high terrain is the decisive factor in every engagement. The Taliban understood this, and their tactical doctrine in the mountain districts of Helmand was built around the assumption that coalition forces would not pursue them above certain altitudes. The Gurkhas did not observe that assumption. Their small unit tactics, honed through the jungle warfare training that all Gurkha battalions conducted regularly in Brunei, were particularly effective in the compound and irrigation channel terrain of the Helmand River Valley. Close-quarter battle in a compound environment where visibility is measured in meters and the geometries of rooms and doorways and narrow alleyways create tactical problems that open-country infantry doctrine does not address, requires a specific kind of training and a specific kind of practiced, reflexive response to contact. The Gurkhas had it. Their training at the Jungle Warfare School in Brunei, which all battalions rotated through, produced a level of small unit coordination in restricted terrain that British commanders consistently described as exceptional. General David Petraeus, the commanding general of coalition forces in Afghanistan, visited 1st Battalion Royal Gurkha Rifles in Helmand in 2010 and was briefed specifically on the battalion's approach to the insurgency in the Nar-e-Sarraj region. The approach, focused on understanding the population and the insurgents' role within it, was exactly the kind of fine-grained human engagement that the Gurkha cultural inheritance, the patience, the non-threatening physical presence in a region where the population shared cultural memory of the Himalayan world, made possible in ways that were harder for other infantry units to replicate. The incident of the route change and the 3 buried devices did not end there, because what the sergeant had produced was not just a life-saving assessment of a specific tactical situation. He had produced, through the specificity of his observations, an intelligence picture that told the American analysts something about the enemy's methods that their orbital surveillance had not. The detail about the cleared drainage ditch mattered enormously. It suggested that the Taliban cell responsible for the emplacement had used the ditch as an approach route to the road, which meant they had either prior knowledge of drone coverage patterns and had timed their movement to avoid overhead observation, or they were operating with a level of counter-surveillance discipline that was more sophisticated than the threat picture for that cell had suggested. Both possibilities were important. Neither had been visible from altitude. Both were visible to a man walking the road. The command wire spool recovered from the ambush site the following morning provided further intelligence. The wire was a specific type, assessed as consistent with supply chains running through the Pakistan border districts, and the quantity of wire remaining on the spool indicated that the device command post had been positioned approximately 60 meters from the road in a compound that had been assessed as uninhabited and unthreatening for the previous 3 months. The compound was searched. Inside it, investigators found evidence of recent occupation, food waste, a discarded medical dressing, and a mobile phone battery that had been connected to a charging circuit built around a solar panel mounted on the compound's roof. The solar panel had been visible on satellite imagery for over 2 months. It had not triggered any assessment of suspicious activity because solar panels in Afghan compounds were not themselves indicators of threat. They were an indicator of prosperity or of access to aid-supplied equipment. The assessment system had seen a solar panel. The Gurkha sergeant had seen a road that didn't feel right. The gap between those 2 forms of intelligence represents something that military theorists had been grappling with since well before Afghanistan, and would continue to grapple with long after. It is the gap between sensor-derived intelligence, which is broad, consistent, and scalable, and human intelligence derived from direct observation by trained eyes, which is narrow, idiosyncratic, and completely non-scalable. You cannot train an orbital sensor to notice the quality of the silence at a bend in a mountain road. You cannot build a database that flags the absence of a tea shop owner from his premises at the wrong time of day, in the wrong district, on a day when 3 other small observations have already loaded the assessment toward a conclusion that no single observation could sustain on its own. You can only produce soldiers who have the depth of experiential knowledge to make that accumulation of observations and the professional credibility to take it to a briefing room and say what they see. The Gurkha sergeant had that depth. He had it because of where he came from and how he had been selected and what 11 years of Gurkha service had done to his capacity to read the world around him. He had it because Gurkha institutional culture, 200 years of it, treats the physical environment as an information source of equal value to any technical intelligence product. Because for 200 years the technical intelligence products available to the Brigade of Gurkhas had been a man with a telescope on a ridge and the guy who came back from the market who heard something. Everything else was supplementary. The Brigade of Gurkhas has been serving Britain in continuous operational deployment since 1815, a period of over 200 years, during which they have fought on every continent except Antarctica, and in every type of terrain the Earth offers. They fought in the North African desert against Rommel's Afrika Korps. They fought in the jungles of Burma against the Imperial Japanese Army in some of the most sustained and brutal close-quarter combat of the Second World War. They fought in the jungle of Malaya during the emergency from 1948 to 1960, four-man patrols spending weeks in deep jungle, moving on foot through terrain that helicopter crews flying above it described as impenetrable, hunting communist guerrillas through a rainforest that killed men through 100 mechanisms that had nothing to do with enemy fire. They fought in Borneo during confrontation in the 1960s, in the Falklands in 1982, in Bosnia, Kosovo, East Timor, Sierra Leone, and then across 11 years in Afghanistan, almost as long as the Malayan emergency that produced some of the foundational doctrine of British counterinsurgency. 26 Victoria Crosses have been won by Gurkha regiments of the British Army. 13 of those went to Nepalese soldiers, which means that the rate of Victoria Cross awards per number of Gurkha soldiers serving is extraordinary by any statistical measure. The citations for those awards and for the conspicuous gallantry crosses and military crosses won in Iraq and Afghanistan share a common thread that runs through all of them. In every case, the action described is one of instinctive, controlled aggression in close terrain, a response to contact that went toward the enemy rather than away from it, executed with a precision and a speed that owed nothing to technological support and everything to the quality of the individual soldier and the small team around him. Acting Sergeant Diprasad Pun, alone on sentry duty at a patrol base in Helmand Province in September 2010, single-handedly repelled an attack by between 12 and 30 Taliban fighters, firing approximately 400 rounds, launching 17 grenades, detonating a claymore mine, and ultimately using his tripod as a weapon when his ammunition ran out. He was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross, Britain's second highest award for gallantry. In the citation, the phrase used to describe his response to the initial contact is immediate and controlled. Not panicked, not desperate. Immediate and controlled. The two things that Gurkha selection and training, built on a foundation of mountain childhood, produced with a consistency that the British Army had relied on for 2 centuries. The Gurkha sergeant's prediction about the convoy and the 3 devices that were found the morning after the route change became part of the informal operational knowledge shared between British and American units in Helmand, not officially documented in the way that a formal intelligence success is documented, not written into doctrine or cited in after-action reports as a case study in human intelligence collection, but passed on the way operational knowledge always passes, through conversation, through the specific language soldiers use when they are talking about what works and what doesn't, in the actual ground truth of a campaign that is more complicated than any headquarters briefing suggests. American advisors who served alongside the Gurkhas in Helmand described in interviews given years later a quality of ground awareness in Gurkha patrols that they found difficult to articulate and impossible to dismiss. One American officer described it as an environmental intelligence that they carry in their bodies, not in their equipment. Another described watching Gurkha soldiers halt a patrol in a village bazaar and change direction on the basis of what appeared to be nothing at all, only to learn later that the lane they had turned away from had contained a buried device that a route clearance team found 2 days after the patrol had passed through. When asked how they knew, the Gurkha section commander described 3 things he had noticed simultaneously: a child who had been playing in the lane who was no longer there, a dog tied outside a shop that was pulling away from the lane rather than toward it, a pattern of dust on the lane surface that suggested it had been swept recently, which was unusual for that specific stretch of ground at that time of day. 3 things, each individually explainable. Together, in that place at that time with that background of operational knowledge behind them, they added up to turn around. The broader lesson of what the Gurkha sergeant saw on that road, and what his peers continued to see on operations across Helmand and Kandahar, and the mountain districts of the Afghan-Pakistan border zone, is not simply a lesson about Gurkha soldiers. It is a lesson about what training and culture and institutional history can do to human perception when they are applied over sufficient time to a sufficient standard. The U.S. Office of Naval Research Study on Battlefield Intuition concluded that the capacity for this kind of subconscious pattern recognition could be developed through training that accumulated enough experience of the relevant environment in enough conditions to build the pattern library that the brain drew on in the moment of assessment. This was correct. What the study could not quantify was the specific depth of the pattern library that a Gurkha soldier brought to the Afghan battlefield, because the relevant experience did not begin in Afghanistan or in military training. It began in the hills of Nepal. It was refined through the Doko race and through the combat infantry course at Catterick, and through the jungle of Brunei, and through Kosovo and East Timor and Sierra Leone. It was passed through the regimental culture from the generations of Gurkha soldiers who had preceded it in the same way that the knowledge of how to read the mountains had been passed through the hill tribes of Nepal for generations before the British Army ever arrived. The American military invested billions of dollars in ground-penetrating radar, in mine detection dogs trained at specialist facilities in the United States, in mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles that could survive a direct IED strike, in route clearance teams with equipment that was among the most technologically sophisticated ground sign detection systems ever built. All of it was valuable. None of it made a man notice that the road didn't feel right before the analysis had started. None of it produced the specific, accumulated, subconscious integration of environmental observation that allowed a Gurkha sergeant to point at a bend in a road on a laminated map and say with quiet, complete certainty that no convoy would survive that night. General Petraeus visited the Gurkhas in Helmand in 2010 and was briefed on what the battalion was doing in its area of operations. The briefing covered tactics, population engagement, reconstruction activity, the approach the Gurkhas had developed to understanding the human geography of their area in the same fine-grained way that they understood its physical geography. Petraeus expressed no surprise at what he was told. He had seen enough of the war by then to know that the human factors, the quality of the individual soldiers, and the culture that shaped them were the decisive factors in a counterinsurgency that had confounded every technologically driven assessment of what it would require to win. He knew the Gurkhas by reputation. By 2010, anyone who had served in Afghanistan knew the Gurkhas by reputation, the same way they knew their reputation in every previous conflict, as soldiers who could do things in difficult terrain that other soldiers could not do, not because they were impervious to fear or fatigue or physical suffering, but because the threshold at which those things stopped them was simply higher than it was for anyone else. The three devices recovered from the road the morning after the route change were assessed as capable of destroying a Jackal light patrol vehicle and likely to kill or seriously wound anyone in the vehicle or within approximately 15 meters of the detonation. The command wire position in the compound had line of sight to the bend in the road. The ambush positions identified alongside the road were consistent with a force of between 20 and 40 fighters equipped with small arms and rocket-propelled grenades. A convoy that had followed the planned route would have encountered the first device before reaching the bend, been channeled by the subsequent vehicle destruction into the ambush position on the roadside, and come under fire from a force positioned with concealment, elevation, and preparation. 11 men against 30 to 40 in a kill zone on a road in a valley in the mountains of Helmand Province at night. The Gurkha sergeant's 7 words had been accurate in every respect. This convoy will not survive the night. He had not run statistical models to reach that conclusion. He had not processed satellite imagery or signals intercepts or biometric databases. He had walked the road for 4 hours and looked at it with eyes that had been learning to read ground since childhood, and he had told the truth about what he saw. The convoy commander ordered the route change. The convoy survived. Somewhere in the intelligence reporting chain, the threat assessment for that route in that sector of Helmand Province remained classified as amber. Elevated caution, not red, not black. Not the road you cancel the mission to avoid. The Gurkha sergeant did not argue the point. He was not the kind of man who argued about intelligence assessments. He was the kind of man who walked roads before convoys used them and read what the roads had to say. He did his job the way Gurkha soldiers had been doing it since before the American intelligence apparatus existed, with his feet and his eyes and 200 years of institutional knowledge carried quietly in his body, out ahead of the convoy, reading the ground. The 3 devices are a number, 7 words are a sentence. 200 years of unbroken service is a tradition. The bend in the road at night in Helmand Province is the place where all 3 of those things meet, and the only measurement that matters is whether the men in the convoy came home. They came home. That is the Gurkha standard. That is what it costs to build it. And that is why, when a man who carries that standard points at a map and says this convoy will not survive the night, the room goes quiet, and the convoy commander reaches for a pen and starts drawing a different route.